President Trump obviously is meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he makes this statement that we are going to take over Gaza, and we meaning the United States of America, and we're going to turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East, make it a beautiful resort town that America controls. And I think this is a pretty interesting proposal. We also have to remember who President Trump is and the art of the deal concept, which we've now seen over and over again in just the first 2 weeks of the Trump presidency. We have seen the deals going on in Canada, in Mexico, all over the world. There's just a lot of movement happening. So sometimes you can throw these kind of statements out there. Do I think they actually are talking about this and having consideration? Absolutely. But do I also think this is just another bit of a warning shot to say, hey, you're not going to want to mess with us. Let's get those hostages free. Let's do what we need to do because we will just take over this land. Whether that's Israel taking over land that's already theirs, or whether that's the U.S. coming in because he said, hey, there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of hidden bombs. We're going to come in. We're going to clear it out. We're going to do a lot of work here, and then we'll rebuild it, and we'll make it something great.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
Yeah, so the same way it's been for 100 years. I think that's a concern that people have as well, which is now you have a situation where, a lot of Gaza is, in rubble. And look, I had a conversation with a friend today who we were going back and forth about this situation. And this has been an ongoing battle. It did not start on October 7th of 2023. That was not the beginning of all of this. That was the final escalation point to get to a war which we've never seen before, where Israel actually went on was on the defensive because they had to after that. After 1,000+ people were slaughtered, what do you expect them to do? And part of war, which I'm sure we'll discuss, is always, historically, maybe not in America, not in recent history, because the way we've handled the war on terror, a lot of times it's land that you're talking about. And there are discussions on where, obviously, the Palestinian citizens would go. Could they get moved to another new plot of land? Could they get moved to other places? And look, as we know, there are a lot of innocent civilians there, by the way, even living in Israel, that are Arab and Palestinian backgrounds. And these people don't necessarily agree with what's going on in Hamas.
That's right. And today we have a new amicus brief that we're filing at the Supreme Court. And this goes back to the Taylor-Force Act. So briefly, the Taylor-Force Act was passed during the first Trump administration. And what it did was it said, we will not send American taxpayer dollars to organizations that fund or pay for terrorism. The Palestinian Authority has a pay-for-slay program where if you were a Palestinian and you killed an Israeli or an American, you received a pension. If you were in prison, they continued to pay. If you died as what they would see as a martyr, they would continue to pay your family. So they are paying for the slaying of Israelis. And that was fortunately put forward. But what now we're seeing, CC, and what we're now having to fight at the Supreme Court is that some courts are blocking implementation of aspects of the Taylor-Force Act because they're concerned it could violate the due process rights of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO.
Right, and jurisdictional issues. Again, can we reach over and reach somebody that's over with the PLO or the Palestinian Authority? And of course, that's what the Taylor-Force Act actually says, is if you are a Palestinian and you decide to kill an American citizen, you're actually saying, I now agree to jurisdiction. When you make that decision that you're going to take an American's life, you're agreeing to the jurisdiction of American courts. And that's what we've argued in this brief. And we will consistently support and stand up against not just the PA, not just Hamas. We talk about Hamas a lot, but the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, that they're just as bad actors as Hamas. And so we have to stand up and say, if you're going to take an American's life, you're going to be held accountable.
Well, and I think this goes back to the discussion we were having earlier about the press conference between Bibi Netanyahu and President Trump, is that there was a lot of great things done during the first Trump administration for Israel. But because of everything and every roadblock that the Biden administration tried to put forward to hinder that progress that was made in the region, it set so many things back that we know on day one that Joe Biden was willfully ignoring the Taylor Force Act, a law passed by Congress, signed by a president, by reinitiating aid to the Palestinians, even though they were still paying for this program. But now that we have this opportunity, we see that the presidency, the executive branch, is much more focused right from the start at getting American policies back in line with what is best for America, what is best for peace in the region. And so while President Trump continues to fight out these new battles and restoring the proper posture of the United States in the region, we also have to have the ACLJ and fighting these battles in court.
Right.
Trying to remind the courts that now it's in their hands what the law says, what the Constitution says, and continue to seek justice for both Americans and Israelis that are slaughtered by Palestinians.
Well, and it's just common sense. You think about, these are taxpayer dollars. So these are U.S. taxpayer dollars that are being sent to these terrorist organizations for those terrorist organizations then to pay people to murder United States citizens, Americans. That is ridiculous and should never happen.
Caleb Myers, who has been an ACLJ, someone we've worked with over the years. Caleb, you've worked with us on the hostage situation. You've worked on so many different things, as you are the founder and chairman of Arise. I want our audience, before we get into what's new and what's happening now, to kind of understand that background of you, where you came from, and also your work with us here at the ACLJ.
Sure. So I'm an Israeli. I founded Arise, which is the Alliance to Reinforce Israel's Security and Economy. And we basically look at the biggest strategic challenges facing Israel and reach out to our friends around the world, most of whom are Christians who believe in the Bible, see Israel as a miraculous fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And we find great organizations and friends like the American Center for Law and Justice who can work with us to help Israel on various issues. And I just, from the beginning, want to say thank you so much to ACLJ for everything you did, particularly with regards to the hostages. And there were several, I think, out of the first 7 girls who were just released in the last 2 weeks, 4 of them had family members that were on our delegations that we actually represented together. So, yeah, thank you for that.
So it's wonderful work that you all are doing, and it's a very intense time. We all know that. But Cece, you can even speak to this. This is something that's been an ongoing thing. And when we were able to get those alerts that, yes, members that were being released, the hostages were being released, were connected, and our families were being represented by both Arise and by the ACLJ, it's pretty remarkable.
It is remarkable, and I'll just have to say, Kalev is a brilliant attorney, and he's just a brilliant, good friend of the ACLJ. I think we have very much kindred spirits, and we have the same goals in mind of supporting Israel. And so with the hostages, it was a great time for us to come together and to be able to bring them to the families to Washington, D.C. and have great high-level meetings. And it's one thing, and I say this a lot of times, even the United Nations, it's one thing to say something and to fight for something that's right, but when you put a personal touch, like the mother or the father or the brother of these hostages talking to these senators and talking to these leaders in D.C., it brings it to a whole nother level. And then we did it in France, we did it in Brussels. And I think that had a good aspect. Again, like you always said, we don't want to forget them. It's, so many months, 400 and however many days it is now. We don't want to forget that those innocent Israelis are still being held hostage, and we celebrate the ones that have been released, but there's still more work to be done.
Absolutely.
But I want to ask you, because we talked about this earlier, why is it, what the work that the ACLJ does and the work that Arise does and the work that you do, why is it so important for America to support Israel, or why should America support Israel?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, one way to answer that is to look at what's happened over the last year. So Israel has just come through its longest war in our history, and the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, which was a great security failing on from our perspective. Obviously, one of the reasons Israel was created was so that stuff like that won't happen again to our people, and so it was a very traumatic situation. Now, a lot of our enemies talk about this war as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But is it really just an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Because everyone who's been firing rockets at us or coming across our borders and carrying out terrorist attacks have been funded by, inspired by, weaponized by Iran. So maybe this is actually an Israeli-Iranian conflict. But is it just an Israeli-Iranian conflict? Because you have, on one side, you have Russia, China, Turkey, Qatar supporting Hamas.
It's a much bigger war.
It's a much bigger war. You have the United States and its allies supporting Israel. So maybe this is an East-West proxy war that Israel's on the front lines. But is it just an East-West proxy war that Israel's on the front lines? Because there's definitely a spiritual aspect to this, right? You have forces of darkness against forces of light, whatever you want to say, the hordes of evil against armies of God or whatever. But you look at the nations that are aligned on one side that really care about human life, and even in the midst of our conflict, we try to protect Palestinian life, right? And then the other side that glorifies death, and for that reason, it's important for the United States to support Israel. When Israel is like a canary in a mine shaft, in the sense that we're on the front line. It doesn't matter what lens you view any of this from. We're on the front line in a battle, which the goal of our enemies is to completely undermine and destroy the very Judeo-Christian foundations of Western society. And it's very important. And when those hordes come across our border, and kidnap people from their homes and burn families alive and murder them in such a grotesque way, for the United States not to do anything, I think would be problematic. Let's say with much power comes much responsibility. And right now, being the greatest superpower in the world, just to sit back and let something like that happen to one of its allies, wherever they are in the world, I think should cause some soul searching.